African nations must have permanent seats on the UN Security Council. The head of the world body tells the African Union. Most of Asia and Latin America don't have a permanent presence either, despite their huge populations. Can the United Nations be reformed? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Rishaad. Salamat. The United Nations is the body that represents the world, but within its highest structures, much of the world isn't represented. Africa, most of Asia and Latin America have no permanent seat on the Security Council. Those with a full-time place at the table, the United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom and France, have veto powers. Their blocking vote can and often does stop the Security Council from making decisions based on their own interests or alliances. The Council's architecture also means that countries like India, home to some 1.4 billion people, have less influence than countries with far smaller populations. So how can reform come about, especially if it's blocked by veto-holding members? Or is the current setup in place now for more than 80 years, with all its flaws, the least worst option? We'll hear from our guest shortly. But first, this report from Joel Evans and that plea from the UN Secretary-General for change.
At the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, a call for reform of the United Nations Security Council from the very top.
The absence of permanent African seats in the Security Council is indefensible. This is 2026, not 1946. Whatever decisions about Africa and the world are on the table, Africa must be at the table.
The United Nations was set up in 1945, after World War II, to prevent future conflicts and maintain peace globally. The Security Council is the primary body responsible for maintaining international peace and security. It's comprised of 15 members. 10 of them are rotating seats. Countries are elected by the UN General Assembly for 2-year terms. The 5 permanent members are the United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom and France, the so-called P5. These countries have veto powers, which allow them to block UN Security Council decisions. These powers frequently prevent them from passing resolutions on major conflicts involving the P5 or other allies, such as in Gaza and Ukraine. And the Council is criticised as unrepresentative. It has undergone some change. The People's Republic of China joined in 1971, and the Russians took the seat previously occupied by the Soviet Union in 1991. But there have been repeated calls for reform to reflect a world vastly different from the one in which the UN was born, with no representatives from Africa, Latin America, and most of Asia on the Council. These calls have been driven by demographic changes. There has been significant population growth in the global south. 1.5 billion people live on the African continent, a figure that's projected to reach 2.5 billion by 2050. Research conducted by Oxfam shows 80% of Security Council resolutions in the past decade have been about conflicts in Africa. Joel Evans, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Denver is Olukayode Bakare, a visiting scholar in international relations and African politics at the University of Colorado, Denver. Mukesh Kapila is a former UN humanitarian coordinator in Sudan. He's in Geneva. And in Cape Town, Tim Murithi, a senior advisor at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, a think tanker. Welcome to all of you. Now, this is a question for all three of you, and it's really down to basic and brass tacks here. And starting off with you, Tim, why should Africa have a seat amongst the permanent members?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I think your segment, your leading segment, said it very well. We have a continent of 1.5 billion people that is not represented at a table that makes decisions that affect, the people on the continent. This is contrasted with the United Kingdom and France, with populations of 67 million each that have a permanent veto. And you can see the discrepancy right away. The optics don't look good for this council. It is a relic of a bygone era. And if Africa is to be represented adequately in the 21st century, then Africa does require to have a seat at the Security Council. The United Nations Pact for the Future Impact statement actually made this requirement as well. Action point 39 call for redress for Africa's historical exclusion and adequate representation on the Security Council. And the African Union's own AU C10, so-called C10 Committee of 10 members of heads of state, have issued a similar statement saying that fair representation, equality, justice demands that Africa should have a seat at the UN Security Council. And your segment was very accurate in pointing almost 80% of the agenda, or at least the resolutions issued by the UN Security Council, affect the African continent or relate to the African continent. And therefore, it is imperative for Africa to be sitting at the heart of these decision-making processes.
Mukesh.
I think there is a prior question as to whether or not there should be any permanent members of the UN Security Council in today's world of sovereign equal countries. This is 2026. But if you are going to stick with the idea of permanent membership, which I dispute, then obviously Africa should also be considered to have some form of permanent membership on the council.
And to you, Olukayode.
Yes, thank you for having me. Yeah. The call for Africa representation at the UN Security Council predate the current geopolitical strategies with the 5 veto powers within the UN Security Council. If you could recall, it's been considered of 2005 historically, champion, the call for the African, country representation within the UN Security Council. However, equal representation of the African continents within the UN Security Council will give the African continent greater voice to be able to participate constructively in the matters that are currently affecting the continent. As we could recollect, African continent, is currently, face a lot of crisis with respect to the current war going on in Sudan, South Sudan, the current crisis going on within the Sahel region.
Olukayode, with that in mind, who would be then the candidates from Africa?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think in my article published with respect to the quest for Africa in the UN Security Council, there are 3 potential strong candidates, such as Egypt, Nigeria, and South Africa. In my argument, I think South Africa has the potential because of its current geopolitical clout within the current geopolitical strategy, and also its role within the G20. So I think South Africa has the potential to lead the AU within the UN Security Council. However, South Africa is currently a threat against the U.S. strategic interests in Africa because South Africa is aligning with Russia, particularly within BRICS membership. So if South Africa gets the mandate to represent Africa within the UN Security Council, definitely the U.S. security strategic interests will be threatened in the region. So the U.S. will advocate for non-veto power within the UN Security Council.
I want to kick that question out also there to Tim briefly.
Yeah, thank you. Look, the debate has actually moved on quite beyond this point of trying to identify which African country will sit, or which group of countries will sit at the Security Council. In 2005, the African Union, in fact, adopted a common position on the reform of the United Nations Security Council, calling for 2 permanent seats with veto rights. 21 years later, the African Union has just adopted what it calls a African Union model on the United Nations Security Council reform. This was adopted by the Council of Ministers in Lusaka, Zambia, last year. And this document is very clear and emphatic in saying that the African Union itself, grouping of 55 countries, will select the representation to the United Nations Security Council. It's also important to note that the African Union has permanent observer status at the United Nations in New York, Geneva, and so on, Nairobi. So the African Union itself can, in fact, be the vehicle for representation. And if we have permanent representation, then the UN, the African Union Peace and Security Council will actually determine which members will be sitting in on a rotational basis at the UN Security Council. So the debate has moved on beyond playing off Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa against each other, because that was clearly the tactic that was used in 2005 and got us nowhere. Now there's a much more coherent strategy going forward of how the African Union itself is the vehicle, if you will, for representation. Again, assuming that we retain this structure going forward. And I think Mukesh's point about whether this is the discussion that we should be having is actually crucial, because the UN Security Council itself has demonstrated it's quite dysfunctional. We saw the genocide in Gaza. We've seen the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022. So there are major questions as to whether this is in fact the structure that should lead us into the 21st century and maintain our system of collective security. And back to you.
And Mukesh, I'm not going to ask you the same question, but, what about the African Union, as a representative on a seat there in the UN? But, I mean, let's face it, African countries have not really been beacons of good governance and democracy, have they? And shown great leadership qualities in the last few decades.
I think most countries who have been on the Security Council, permanent or non-permanent, they have been representatives of their national interest rather than the global interest. And what our African friends should learn is not to make the mistakes that the rest of the world has made for the last 80 years. And that is, certainly do not go for a permanent member who is fixed for the next 80 years, because they will be no better than any of the permanent members that have been good and bad in equal measure in the last 80 years. But a rotating membership is probably a good idea. I think another important point is that if you're talking about the United Nations reform, question is, where do you start? Now, we all fix on the Security Council, and we all fix on reforming the Security Council, which is the most difficult part of UN reform. And I think we're not going to get anywhere with that. Also, what we are avoiding in these questions is the issue of governance, which was your point. And that is, if we don't improve the quality of global governance by the individual members of the world, whether in Africa or elsewhere, in different positions of responsibility, then I think we're not going to go very far at all. And so I would counsel that we devote attention to UN Security Council affairs and its reform, but take it in the wider context of UN reform and UN governance if we are to achieve the impact of a changing world that everyone is aspiring to.
Olukayode, I want you to keep your answer brief because your line isn't very stable at the moment. Could you tell us, about the geostrategic challenges facing this in full realization of what we're talking about?
For Africa to be included within the UN Security Council, first of all, we have to look at the case of a governance issue in Africa. Because if Africa is included within the UN Security Permanent seat, for instance, that may not, solve the problem of Africa. The problem of Africa, derives particularly from within the internal dimension of the socio-economic and political crisis ravaging the region. Yep. For instance, the World Bank and IMF admitted Africa in 2023 within the IMF and World Bank Executive Board. Rather, this has not alleviated the crisis with respect to poverty syndrome in African continent. So if Africa is admitted within the UN Security Council, I doubt if there will be any positive or significant changes on the continent.
I want to get this question to Mukesh, the next one, as we move on and broaden this. Surely India, with the world's most populous country and biggest democracy, the EU is an entity instead of the UK and France and Brazil. Shouldn't they also be eligible?
Well, I think many countries should be eligible. But look at the bigger picture. We are now living in the post-rule of law order, where might is right ideology is ruling. Now, do you really want to sustain the system by saying that only the big countries, the most populous countries, like my own country of birth, India, or the most economically strong powers, Brazil and so on, should be the ones who decide to rule the world? So I think this is a very we're going down the wrong track. If you postulate a world which is ruled by the strongest in the world, with the biggest economies, with nuclear weapons, with the forces or geographical area, then I think we are no better off than we are at the present. So, but if you're talking about democratic way of running the world, in which big and small, powerful and less powerful, rich and poor, have a way of influencing the way the world works, then I think we have to not talk about whether Brazil or India or Africa are on the committee, let alone permanently, but about the sorts of countries or the sorts of ways in which you're going to elect the governance of the world. And obviously, if it's to be democratic, if at a country level, you can get rid of your governments if you want after a few years. While in the world, if you elect a permanent member, you can't get rid of them. What kind of governance is that to rule the world? So there are fundamental questions really about how we want the world to be governed before we go down to the micro level as to which state should come in and whether they should have a veto power, whether they should be permanent or not permanent.
So Tim, the question then becomes, all right, permanent and not permanent, what I think Mukesh is getting at is a wholesale change in the root and branch of the UN, a huge reform of it. What would you say to that?
No, I'd completely concur with that. I think we've come to the point where the UN system as a whole needs a serious rethink. And it turns out that the founders of the United Nations, within the Charter 1945, included a provision, Article 109 of the United Nations Charter, which calls for a general conference to review the Charter of the United Nations. And the important point about this article is it cannot be vetoed, at least the general conference cannot be vetoed by the permanent five, which means that the world as a whole can in fact come together and have a focused discussion as to what sorts of governance systems do we want to develop in the 21st century. In any case, to reform the Security Council, you would need to open up the Charter to review. And so this is a natural pathway that we should be exploring much more deeply. There is an Article 109 coalition of think tanks that's working on this issue going forward. And I think we're at that stage where we even heard from, for example, Washington criticizing the current system as being obsolete. We've seen members of the P5 invading other countries. We've seen the attempts to unravel the norms that we have and laws that we've benefited from. We see an international legal order still struggling to hold on. The International Court of Justice provisional measures, against the Israel Gaza case, and we've seen the ICC also issue arrest warrants for Putin and Netanyahu. And so we have a legal order that we have to protect. If we don't build a global governance edifice around it, which means finding a way to get to that point, then we will still be having this conversation in a decade's time, and the world will be a much worse for it at that point in time. So I think this Article 109 conference is absolutely crucial going forward.
Mukesh, I mean, if you added more numbers to the UNSC, the Security Council, I mean, wouldn't this just ultimately make the body's inertia even worse?
Well, I think it's not a question of numbers, large or small. It's a question of the right problems coming to the right level of the right forum for solution. I mean, we live in a world where we are blessed with a range of multilateral options. And we have regional bodies like the African Union. We have other ad hoc groupings. And those who say that multilateral ways of solving problems are over, that's not true. Countries are cooperating together. So to expect the UN of 1946 with its outdated structures and systems to solve the problems of the modern world through one mechanism, Security Council or General Assembly or ECOSOC or the other mechanisms, is, I think, missing the point. Today, we should not bring all our problems to the United Nations. So those problems that can be resolved locally between countries and regionally should be done at that level. And only global problems should come to global forums. So if you look at it like that way, then the idea of global governance and the UN's role in it becomes much more feasible. Some things we can bring to the Security Council, even if as the Security Council that is now, and other things will go to other fora. And that way we will have a network governance, the right problems coming to the right fora for appropriate solutions in their own context. And so the issue of narrow UN reform is not important, because we need a global, wider reform of the way we wish to govern the world.
Yeah, and here to Tim. Now, surely any reform would have to go to the UN Security Council, which could just veto it. Now, the problem with that is, why would you vote for it and end your own dominance? It's like sitting on a branch and sawing it off.
Yes, I think the quote there, the slogan is that turkeys don't vote for Christmas, and that is absolutely true. But at the same time, the UN Security Council is a sinking ship. It is a very dysfunctional structure. That is, in fact, I think has led to a number of genocides in our time, from 94, Rwanda, 2005, Srebrenica, and now we just witnessed the one in Gaza, 2022 to the present, 2023 to the present. And so we must not be trying to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic as it's sinking. It will still sink. Even if you scale up the membership from 15 to 26, as you've adequately pointed out, you're simply going to increase the level of inertia and the level of brinksmanship. And so we've got to the point where we actually got to think outside the box. We've got a veto-proof pathway to get a conversation of all 193 member states of the United Nations. And this is Article 109 and the General Conference to review the United Nations Charter itself. I mean, the founders themselves put the clause in, so it must have a functional region. And let me disagree slightly with Kayode that Africa must get its house in order before it actually gets a seat at the table, so to speak, because Africa having a seat at the table is in fact a matter of right, not a matter of charity. Nobody is granting this to the African continent. African continent is the largest grouping within the United Nations system of 193 countries, and basic elements of natural common justice. Even the consent of the governed, the basic principles of democracy actually demand that Africa should be sitting at that table with equal representation and equal voting power. So I think the whole issue of getting the house in order is something that can be done in parallel, and we are in fact working on that adequately, or with lots of challenges, but still pushing it along. And so I think we should not be, as I said, trying to essentially expand a system that's already broken. The table is broken. So rather than trying to, sit at the broken table, let's in fact redesign the whole table. And again, using this pathway of Article 109 and a general conference to review the United Nations Charter.
Mukesh, let's not forget that, everybody focuses on the bad out of the UN, but they've had some remarkable successes in the last 80 years in terms of peacekeeping, human rights, and bringing global cooperation. But is it fit for purpose in the future? But let's not also celebrate its wins.
I think it was fit for the purpose based on what the purpose was at the time it was being made. But the world has changed. Problems have changed. Aspirations have changed. And that's why I think the table now no longer being fit to sit around is probably a very apt analogy. Having said that, therefore, it doesn't follow that we have just another more polished up table, because there are also other variations. You can have two tables. You can have tables side by side. So there are many geographical configurations. And by the way, while I'm on the subject, just because a million years ago, tectonic plates shifted and Algeria and South Africa happened to find themselves on the same landmass, what is there in common in Africa? Why should we look upon the world in the way we have defined the world in terms of these geographical landmasses? It may be that South Africa has got more in common with Brazil, and Algeria has more in common with, Burkina Faso or East Timor or something like that. My point I'm saying is that if you are going to make a fundamental difference to the way the table is going to be designed, then I think don't look on it just simply in terms of the accident of geography an African landmass, an Asian landmass, a European landmass. Okay, this is the way we look at it for pragmatic and practical reasons, but there are other ways of looking at fairness in representation of the peoples and communities of the world. And I think this Article 109 and other discussions are very important to design that in a way that is going to take us forward, not simply repair the current tables around which we are trying to sit.
And thanks to our guests, Mukesh, Kapila, Olukayode, Bakare, and Tim Murithi. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's Facebook, of course, .com/AJ Inside Story. You also can join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Rishaad, Salamat, and the whole of the team right here in Doha. Bye for now.